Good evening, everyone. It is Wednesday evening my time. I am not sure when this will actually get posted, but that means it's time for another Wednesday devotional. Now, I've realized the last two of these have been kind of mini sermons, which is fine, but I wanted to try something different this week. For at least the next month, I'd like to take a look at the four Gospels. If this seems interesting, what I think the best thing to do is don't take my word for it, experience it for yourself. All right, I'm going to switch over here now. You don't need to see me. I'm going to switch over to my slides fully there. Now, not only will it make these videos more meaningful, I think that this is something that is necessary for Christians to do. And I don't throw that word around lightly. I don't use that word a lot, necessary, in the Christian walk. Okay, I'm happy to leave one's Christian walk and faith between a person and the Holy Spirit. But I actually do feel quite strongly about this. If one claims to be a follower of Jesus, one should actually have some familiarity with the story of Jesus. Not only that, much of the New Testament assumes that the readers are familiar with the Jesus story. Paul's message, Hebrews, all of these other letters, they're based off of Jesus' words and teachings and who Jesus is. Book of Revelation begins a revelation of Jesus Christ. In particular, the book of Revelation, interpreting that book without a strong foundation in Jesus can be, at best, nonsensical. At worst, it can be dangerous. We get caught up in all of these images and all of these symbols, and if you're not grounded in Jesus, it can be very dangerous to try and interpret all of those things. We can get really lost in the weeds. Even more dangerous than that is letting someone else interpret Revelation for us without us having a strong foundation in Jesus. So let's look then at the four Gospels over the next few weeks, and I'm going to start out in the Gospel of Mark. Now, why am I starting out in Mark? Well, it's not a unanimous view, but a strong consensus of current Bible scholarship holds that Mark was likely the first Gospel written. Now, there are a number of reasons why people say this. I won't get into the reasons in detail now, but here are two. And if you look at the slide here, first, Mark is by far the shortest of the Gospels. Second, a lot of Mark is found in both Matthew and Luke, sometimes word for word the same across a number of verses. It seems far more likely then that Mark started things out with this shorter account of Jesus and the story, and then Matthew and Luke kind of took Mark's account, edited that, added stuff on, and that seems much more likely than Mark taking Matthew and Luke and just chopping these massive pieces off, right? Especially if you think these early Christians, they held these writings and these stories to be sacred, writings and stories about Jesus. Why would then Mark take these sacred stories and leave some really important stuff off? For example, Mark does not have any accounts of Jesus' birth. And you'd think that if Mark had access to these things, he would certainly leave those on rather than taking those out. But those things do not appear in Mark at all. Now, I will confess, for a long time, Mark was my least favorite of the four Gospels. One, not only is this the shortest Gospel, but it is also missing a lot of what we might call the greatest hits of Jesus' life. The birth narratives, the Sermon on the Mount, parables of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, the woman at the well, and the resurrection of Lazarus. None of these beloved and awesome passages appear in Mark, and it's a lot like going to the concert of your favorite band or artist and they don't play any of their greatest, most familiar hits. People would feel kind of shortchanged, and that's kind of how I felt reading Mark. A lot of these really awesome stories are not there. It seems like something's missing. You know, further than that, the narrative seems a little bit rushed. The Greek, especially, is kind of abrupt and unrefined. And on the surface, there are some really difficult teachings about Jesus, and that even Jesus says. For example, why does Jesus almost always tell people after a miracle or after a healing to keep the good news about what just happened to them a secret? A lot of times Jesus says, don't tell anybody about this. And I didn't understand that. You know, this is not what we were taught in Sabbath school. For example, when we sing, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." Okay, we're supposed to tell people about Jesus, not keep it secret. But in Mark, a lot of times Jesus tells people, don't tell anybody about this, keep it secret, just keep it, among yourselves. So those are a few reasons why Mark was my least favorite gospel, and I didn't read it a lot. When I was growing up, I preferred to read a lot of the other gospels. But suffice to say, I've come full circle. I now see this very differently. I now see Mark's brevity and urgency as important parts of the gospel's agenda. In fact, although Mark is the shortest gospel, the author's language is actually very vivid. Often Mark includes details that are left out of the other Gospels. Here's an example. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell the story of the Gerasene demoniac. Okay, this guy, or in Matthew, guys. There's two people in Matthew. But they all tell the story of this guy who lives among the tombs and had a legion of demons in him. Only Mark paints this picture, this very vivid picture of this sort of supernatural powerhouse. Okay, he's not just a crazy guy. He's not just a dangerous guy. No, this is supernatural terror. Okay, people had tried to subdue and restrain him. They even put shackles and chains on him, but Mark tells us he bent these chains. He broke the shackles in pieces. He's built up like this unstoppable Hulk monster. But of course, then in Mark, Jesus steps up and he just owns this entire legion of demons. Okay, so this is not just something that is disturbing. It's not something that's just scary. I mean, this is supernatural terror that Jesus is going up against, but he just casts all of these demons out, and the man is healed. The language may not be as focused as Matthew or as elegant as Luke, but Mark uses these sort of literary twists and reversals of expectation in a way that is just masterful, I find. And I can't say which gospel is my favorite. I don't say that I really have a favorite gospel, but I now hold that Mark is absolutely not any less than any of the other three that we have, in the Bible. Mark stands up there with all of them, kind of on the same plateau that I have now. I love this book. I love this gospel. So again, a pretty strong scholarly consensus holds that Mark was the earliest gospel. So to whom was this written, and what do we know about the person who wrote it? Well, like all of the other gospels, the author is anonymous. Nowhere in the gospels does it say who wrote them, but very early on, church tradition began associating this gospel with John Mark. Okay, this character who is a companion of Paul in Acts, and then possibly also a companion of Peter. There is a Mark mentioned in 1 Peter 5:13. Now, although we can't be sure of the identity of the author, it seems that whoever wrote this gospel was very familiar with Roman vocabulary and culture. He does not bother to define Roman terms. Okay, they're not explained. It just throws out these words like legion, denarius, praetorium. All of these words would have been meaningful to somebody who knew about Roman culture. Okay, and so Mark doesn't bother explaining them. However, the author is clearly not writing to an audience that is well versed in the language and culture of Palestine or Israel. Mark records, it's very interesting, Mark will write down Aramaic words, and this is in Greek writing, but they're obviously Aramaic words and phrases. Talitha kum at the end of the story of Jairus and his daughter. Korban. Jesus' last words on the cross in Mark, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. All of these are Aramaic words or phrases. But Mark takes very special care to translate and interpret these words for the readers of this gospel. Mark will say something like, Jesus said to this girl, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, get up. Okay, so Mark will translate this and explain, give a little bit of what the meaning of this phrase is. Because of this, scholars believe that Mark was likely written to Christians in Rome, or at least nearby Rome, at the very least a heavily Roman-oriented part of the empire. Okay, so these are Christians not in Palestine, not around Israel. These are people who know the story of Jesus, but they're not familiar with the language or maybe the practices of the region from where Jesus came. And so Mark takes special care to explain these things. I previously mentioned that Mark seems to be in a hurry. Mark's favorite word is in Greek, euthus. There it is in Greek there. It means immediately or at once. This word appears 42 times in this gospel, and in fact 11 times in Mark chapter 1 alone. Okay, immediately they left their nets. Immediately he called them. As soon as they left the synagogue. All of these things, that word euthus. And I tell my Greek students that episodes seem to happen right on top of each other in this gospel. Okay, it's like no time passes. Immediately something happens. Immediately something else. It's almost like Jesus is teleporting from one place or scene to another. Okay, so this word here is a very important part of Mark and the presentation of Mark. Another aspect of Mark's gospel that is only evident in the original Greek is the use of what scholars call the historical present. What is that? Well, historical present is taking an event that obviously took place in the past, but describing that action with a present tense verb. And you're reading along, and it looks like bad grammar. And when you translate it into English, they will almost always take this and translate it as a past tense. Okay, but the effect is that Mark draws the reader into the action of the story. This makes the impact sort of immediate for the listener. And really, we still tend to do it today. One would probably not think much was amiss if, for example, I was telling a story, and I told the story like, so yesterday, I was helping my son with his homework, and he says to me, Dada, I love you. Okay, there I said, he says to me, present tense verb, but I'm clearly describing something that happened in the past. I'm wanting to put you there, like you are there with me, hearing this for the first time. Mark seems to be very fond of this. Okay, this historical present actually appears 151 times. Okay, and just repeatedly using this to sort of give this gospel this sense of urgency and vividness, in addition to this sort of immediately, everything is happening really fast, and you've got to hear this. Mark is also saying, I want you to be a part of this. I want you to experience this with me. Mark is also fond of a literary framing device called an inclusio or an intercalation. Okay? And I spoke about one example from Mark in a sermon a few weeks ago. This is in Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. And there we meet a man named Jairus, a leader of the synagogue, and he comes to Jesus and he pleads with Jesus to come with him to his house because his daughter is at the point of death. Right? He begs Jesus, please come and heal her. And so it says Jesus starts on his way. But just as Jesus begins to go, interrupting this story is another story. Okay? And that is of a woman afflicted for 12 years with this hemorrhaging or menstrual bleeding. And it says, it gives a bunch of details. Jesus heals her. And then the Jairus story picks up again. Okay? This story of the woman with bleeding kind of interrupts this story. Now, the healing of the woman is amazing, but what happens with this inclusio? He kind of breaks up that story of Jairus. He turns attention to this woman, kind of ratchets up this tension to 11, right? We're still wondering, hey, what's happening with Jairus? Jesus, you're kind of in a hurry. This guy needs you to come and heal his daughter. And then we find out right after the story of the woman with the bleeding, hey, Jairus, your daughter has died. Okay. Just cranking up that tension. What is going to happen? Well, daughter has died. The story seems to be over, but then, of course, it's not over. And Mark pays off the entire thing in the grandest way by moving back to Jairus' story, taking us to his house, and Jesus raises this girl from death. This story within a story technique is used several times in Mark. It's always to make a point, but also to kind of leave the reader on our toes as we wait for the resolution, and it often gives greater meaning or interpretation to that original story. Now, I mentioned earlier one of the most striking things about Mark's gospel. Jesus seems to be unusually invested in secrecy and mystery. Why is this? Okay, after almost every miraculous healing, Jesus tells the people he heals, don't say anything about me. Don't say what happened here. Okay, and as an example, just talked about the story of Jairus and his daughter. At the very end of that, Mark 5, verse 43, it says, he strictly ordered them that no one should know about this. Now, why is Jesus so concerned about secrecy? Particularly when it's good news. Not only is it good news, it's news that makes him look good. Okay? You just raised a girl from death, Jesus. Why are you telling them not to tell anybody? Furthermore, isn't this counter to everything that we've been taught? I mean, we're supposed to share the gospel, right? We're supposed to preach the gospel to other people, tell other people about Jesus. What is going on here? Well, in order to understand this, we first have to understand the most important part of the Jesus story according to Mark. And what is that? It's Jesus' passion. Okay, in other words, the events leading up to his arrest, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. Now, I said before, Mark's narrative proceeds very rapidly and urgently, right? Immediately. We're just moving and everything is happening fast. And that's true, but only up to a point. You see, at chapter 11, once we get the story of the triumphal entry, the pace of Mark's narrative slows down, and it's noticeable. We have the 10 previous chapters covering all of Jesus' ministry. and everything is happening fast. The stories are happening on top of each other. Mark can't even wait to tell another story. He's interrupting his own stories. Chapter 11, everything just slows down to a crawl. Chapters 11 through 16 now are going to cover those last few days of Jesus' life. We've had 10 chapters covering his entire ministry, and then suddenly almost the last half of the book is just covering a few days. It's so obvious and so noticeable if you're reading this carefully. What does this mean for a reader? Okay, well, what does it mean in a movie? Say we go to like a big blockbuster hit movie, okay, and there's a lot of action happening, everything is exciting, and scenes are happening on top of each other almost, but then suddenly everything just switches and slows down into like super slow motion. Okay, imagine like an action movie, okay, but then we see a sniper on top of a building aiming his rifle at something, and we see him fire that rifle, and we actually see like the bullet exiting the barrel, and everything slows down so much you can kind of see that bullet spinning. What do we know about this if we're watching a movie like that? Something important is about to happen. And what is the effect of that same thing happening in Mark? Okay, everything, all of the action just slows down. Well, Jesus' crucifixion and everything surrounding it is the most important thing to Mark. And in fact, it's so important. Mark says you cannot understand the Jesus story until you understand this most important thing. The entire point of Jesus' mission was his suffering and his death. Without that, what is the meaning of all of the miracle stories? What's the meaning of all of the wonderful things that are happening before? Hey, without that, the greatest miracles, okay, casting out demons, raising a girl from death, multiplying food for a multitude, these miracle stories are at best, Mark says, a distraction. More likely, in fact, a cause of severe understanding, unless you get the main point. Now, the best illustration I know of this is in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 38. There we start out with this like really weird story. It's only found in Mark, but it's a story of Jesus healing a blind man. But again, only in Mark, it seems to take Jesus 2 tries to get it right. The first time, Jesus heals this guy, and he asks him, "What do you see?" And the man says, I can see things, but it's not clear. Okay, he says, "I see people, and they're walking around, and they look like trees." The second time, then Jesus heals him kind of again, and the second time, now he sees clearly. So what's going on here? What is this story saying? Like, did Jesus mess up that first time? Did he not quite get it right? Well, immediately after this story, we have Peter's declaration about Jesus. He says, "You are the Messiah." Right? Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?" Peter, "You are the Messiah." Peter knows who Jesus is. But wait. Right after this declaration, "You are the Messiah," 8 verse 31, "Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, and he would be killed and rise again." What does Peter do? The same guy who just said, "You are the Messiah," well, Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. What are you teaching about this? You can't be teaching that you're going to suffer and die. What are you doing, Jesus? Then Mark says Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan." He saw, but he didn't quite see clearly. He didn't get the heart of what Jesus was teaching. The scene ends with Jesus calling all the crowd and his disciples together and teaching them, "If anyone wants to become my followers, let them take up their cross and follow me." This entire passage is repeating this point in several ways, right? The blind man is healed, but he doesn't see clearly at first. He doesn't know what it is he's seeing. Peter knew who Jesus was. He saw who Jesus was, but he didn't fully get it. He didn't see clearly. In fact, he didn't fully get it until he understood that Jesus had to suffer and die. And Mark says, actually, none of the disciples really got it until after Jesus' death. To be a follower of Jesus, you have to deny yourself. Take up your cross. Literally follow in Jesus' footsteps. And if you try to fast forward to the fun parts, if you try to only have the victory without the cross, you're not seeing the whole picture. In fact, you will never understand until you get the heart of Mark's message. Victory only happens on the other side of the cross. As I read this part of Mark, I think that American Christianity, with our emphasis on things like prosperity, we are God's chosen people, American exceptionalism, but we want those things without an understanding of denying oneself, following the suffering Savior. And we as Christians in America would do well to heed Mark's warning. You don't see the whole picture. You can't see clearly until you know the truth about the cross and suffering and what looks like defeat. Until you know those things, you'll never know what victory is. One last note on Mark. It's a characteristic of a lot of Mark's stories. He likes to leave the audience kind of hanging. We want like a fuller explanation, and Mark just drops us off of a cliff and gives no resolution. A lot of these stories do not get tidy resolutions, and it's interesting that in other Gospels they tend to explain things that Mark leaves unsaid. Again, from Mark chapter 8. This is right after Jesus has miraculously fed 4,000 men. And it says that he and the disciples got into a boat, but the disciples forgot to bring bread for the boat ride. Jesus tells them, when it's found out that they have no bread, Jesus says, "Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." Matthew and Luke both report this, but they tell us what Jesus meant. They explain this saying that Jesus just said. Kind of a weird saying, right? Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. So Mark and Luke explain this. Matthew says, Jesus then tells them again, beware the teaching of the Pharisees. Luke says it means beware the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. But Mark doesn't explain this. Mark doesn't give us any of this. He just kind of leaves the disciples just confused, and Jesus getting really frustrated by their inability to get what he's saying. In fact, the end of this episode here, Mark 8:21, has Jesus saying to the disciples, like in total frustration, like, "Do you not yet understand?" And that's the end of the story. The way that I actually read this, the way that I imagine it, is that Mark has Jesus speaking to these disciples, dialoguing with them, and then suddenly Jesus turns away from the disciples and kind of looks directly at us, the readers, kind of breaking that fourth wall, they say in filmmaking or storytelling. And Jesus like looks right into the camera, so to speak, at the reader and asks us, "So, do you not yet understand?" Dropping the reader off of a cliff, leaving things unsaid, asking uncomfortable questions of the reader. Nowhere better is this tendency to just drop readers off of a cliff and leave us to find our own meaning than at the end of Mark 16. Now, where is that end? There's a little bit of debate about that. In fact, there is strong evidence that Bible translators were so befuddled by the end of Mark that they added on material taken from other gospel accounts to kind of shore up the story and make the ending make sense. Okay, the earliest and most reliable manuscripts we have of Mark, they end at verse 8. The women ran from the tomb on Easter morning. They said nothing to anyone about Jesus' resurrection because they were afraid. And that's it, the end. Now wait a second, what's going on here? That can't be the end of the story. First of all, how is that an uplifting ending? Okay, this is the end of the gospel, good news, right? How is this a good ending? They were afraid? And that's it? How do we even know that all of this happened if the only witnesses to the event ran away and said nothing? One possibility. Mark is leaving the question open to us. By ending it there, with this non-ending, Mark leaves that question hanging, and it's up to us to answer it. What will we do now? What will we do now that we know the full story? The good news, the healings, the miracles, sure, but also now the suffering and the death, and yes, the resurrection. The tomb is sitting there, it's lying empty before us. And what is our reaction? Are we afraid? Are we going to run away? Or are we going to get up, follow Jesus, and spread the gospel? Mark says someone obviously told someone, who told someone, and way down the line, somebody told us. Somebody told me. Now, what are you going to do now that you've heard the story? Are you going to do your part and tell someone? Or are you going to run away from that tomb, afraid, and tell nobody? Now, there's one more detail that I need to talk about, and then I'm done. Mark 16, verse 7, there is a young man at the tomb who tells the women who came to see the tomb empty, "Go and tell his disciples that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Now, that's what we are told to do at the end of the story, right? Meet Jesus in Galilee. But that's not a historical detail meant for the women and Jesus' disciples. If you go back to the beginning of Mark 1 verse 9, Mark 1:9, in those days Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. At the end of Mark, meet Jesus in Galilee. The beginning of Mark, in those days Jesus came from Galilee. I subscribe to the idea that when the end of Mark says meet him in Galilee, it's not just a detail from the story. It really is a message for us, the readers. It's a challenge, if you would. Meet Jesus in Galilee, go back to the beginning. And yeah, meet Jesus as he comes from Galilee again. In other words, read through this account again. Immerse yourself in the story of Jesus. Read it over and over again until you know this story. Not only know this story, but you live and you breathe the story. Tell me the story of Jesus. Write on my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. And Mark says if you take up this invitation, I guarantee you, you will learn something new every time that you read it. Church, I know I do every time I read this, even the shortest and most urgent of all the Gospels. So here at the end of Mark, Jesus turns to us and asks, do you not yet understand? Meet Jesus in Galilee again.